The autumn wind carried the scent of dried grass and distant wood smoke across the Montana Territory, cutting through Margaret Hale's worn wool coat as she balanced on the ladder against the horse barn. October of 1892 had brought an early chill, and the roof needed mending before the first snow. She pressed another cedar shingle into place, her calloused hands steady despite the gusting breeze that threatened to knock her hat clean off her head. Margaret had learned to do most everything herself since Thomas passed 3 winters ago. The small ranch wasn't much, 60 acres of stubborn prairie land, a handful of cattle, 2 horses, and a vegetable garden that produced just enough to see her through the harsh months. But it was hers, and she'd be hanged before she'd let it fall to ruin. The sound of small footsteps crunching through the fallen leaves made her pause, hammer suspended mid-swing. She looked down to see a little girl standing at the gate, no more than 7 years old, with sandy brown hair braided neatly down her back and cheeks flushed pink from the wind. The child wore a simple blue dress and a threadbare shawl, but her boots looked sturdy enough for the walk she must have taken to get here. "Ma'am," the girl called out, her voice carried away by a particularly strong gust before finding its way back to Margaret's ears. Margaret set down her hammer and climbed carefully down the ladder, brushing wood shavings from her hands. "Well, hello there, little one. You're a long way from town." The girl shifted from foot to foot, clutching something against her chest. "Are you Miss Margaret Hale?" "I am. And who might you be?" "Annie Reed, ma'am." The child stepped closer, extending a folded piece of paper with careful reverence, as if it contained something precious. "Papa says he can't stop thinking about you." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She stared at the letter, then at the earnest face of the child before her. The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a distant fire, unexpected, puzzling, and somehow warming despite her confusion. "Your papa sent you all this way to tell me that?" Margaret asked, accepting the letter with hands that trembled slightly. She couldn't decide if the trembling came from the cold or from something else entirely. Annie nodded solemnly. "He wrote it down special, said I was to give it only to you and nobody else." Margaret turned the paper over in her hands. Her name was written across the front, in careful, if somewhat unsteady, handwriting. The paper was rough, the kind sold at Henderson's general store in town, and it had been folded with obvious care. She found herself oddly reluctant to open it in front of the child, as if doing so might reveal secrets too large for young ears. "Annie Reed," she repeated, trying to place the name. "Your father, he wouldn't be Samuel Reed, would he? The one who raises cattle over near Willow Creek?" "Yes'm, that's Papa. Do you know him?" Margaret searched her memory. She recalled seeing a tall man at the market several months back, leading a string of horses through town. He'd tipped his hat when their eyes met across the dusty Main Street, but they'd never spoken. She remembered thinking he had kind eyes and capable hands, the sort of man who looked like he knew his way around both livestock and trouble. "I may have seen him once or twice," Margaret said carefully, "but I can't say we've ever been properly introduced." The wind picked up again, sending dried leaves skittering across the yard and making Annie pull her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Margaret made a decision that had more to do with the child's welfare than her own curiosity about the mysterious letter. "You must be cold. Dear, why don't you come inside while I read this? I've got fresh milk warming on the stove, and there might be some of yesterday's biscuits left." Annie's face brightened considerably. "Papa said you'd be kind. He said you were the sort of woman who'd share what she had, even with strangers." The observation struck Margaret as oddly specific, and she found herself wondering just how much this Samuel Reed had observed about her from whatever distance he'd been keeping. The thought was both flattering and slightly unsettling. She'd grown accustomed to privacy in the years since Thomas's death, to the comfort of knowing exactly who was watching and why. She led Annie through the front door into the modest cabin that served as both home and fortress against the unforgiving prairie winters. The main room held a stone fireplace, a small dining table Thomas had built with his own hands, and 2 chairs positioned to catch the morning sun through the single window. The kitchen occupied one corner, separated from the living space by a simple pine counter, and a narrow staircase led to the sleeping loft above. Margaret settled Annie at the table and poured warm milk into a tin cup, adding a generous dollop of honey from her dwindling supply. She placed 2 biscuits on a plate beside it, noting how the child's eyes widened with obvious hunger despite her polite restraint. "Go ahead, dear. Eat what you'd like." While Annie ate with the careful manners of a well-raised child, Margaret finally opened the letter. The handwriting inside matched that on the envelope, careful but unpracticed, as if the writer had labored over each word. "Miss Hale, I hope you'll forgive the liberty of writing to you without proper introduction. My name is Samuel Reed, and I live with my daughter Annie about a mile west of your place, near the creek. I've seen you working your land these past months, and I wanted you to know that I admire your strength and determination. It takes considerable courage to manage a ranch alone, and you do it with more grace than most men I know could manage. I don't mean to presume, but if you ever have need of assistance with repairs or heavy work, I'd be honored to help. I ask nothing in return except perhaps the chance to make your acquaintance properly. With sincere respect, Samuel Reed." Margaret read the letter twice, her cheeks growing warm despite the cool air seeping through the cabin's gaps. It was a straightforward message, respectful and honest, but something about it unsettled her. She wasn't accustomed to male attention, particularly from men she barely knew. In the 3 years since Thomas's death, she'd grown comfortable with solitude, with the predictable rhythms of her own company. "Did your papa tell you what he wrote in this letter?" she asked Annie, who was methodically working her way through the second biscuit. "No, ma'am. Papa said it was between grown folks." Annie paused, her small hand wrapped around the warm cup. "But he's been awful quiet lately, and sometimes I catch him looking off toward your place when he thinks I'm not watching." Margaret folded the letter carefully and set it aside. "How far did you walk to get here, Annie?" "About an hour, I reckon. Papa's off moving cattle to the south pasture, so he don't know I came, but I heard him talking to himself about the letter, and I thought maybe if I brought it, he'd stop being so restless all the time." The innocence of the statement struck Margaret with unexpected force. This child had walked more than a mile alone across open prairie, because she'd noticed her father's unease and wanted to help. It spoke well of both her courage and Samuel Reed's character that he'd raised such a thoughtful daughter. "Well, that was very brave of you," Margaret said. "But your papa will be worried when he finds you gone." "Yes'm, I expect he will. But maybe now he won't spend so much time staring off into nothing." Margaret found herself smiling despite her confusion. "You're a wise little girl. Annie Reed. But next time you want to help your papa, maybe you should talk to him first before taking such a long walk by yourself." "Yes'm." Annie finished her milk and wiped her mouth carefully with the back of her hand. Do you think you might want to meet Papa proper? He's not much for talking, but he's good with horses, and he makes the best flapjacks in the whole territory." The earnest hope in the child's voice tugged at something Margaret had thought she'd buried with her husband. She looked again at the letter, at the careful handwriting and respectful words. Samuel Reed was clearly a man who understood boundaries, who offered help without demanding anything in return, in a territory where many men saw a widow as either a burden or an opportunity. Such restraint was both rare and reassuring. "I think," Margaret said slowly, "that would be nice, but for now, I'd better get you home before your papa discovers you've gone adventuring." She bundled Annie back into her shawl and walked her to the gate, watching as the little girl set off across the prairie with the same determined stride that had brought her here. Only when Annie had disappeared over the first rise did Margaret allow herself to read the letter one more time. The wind had died down, leaving the late afternoon unusually quiet. Margaret stood in her yard, letter in hand, and tried to remember the last time anyone had noticed her strength rather than her solitude. It was a strange feeling, being seen that way, not as poor widow Margaret who needed charity or pity, but as a woman capable of managing her own life. She folded the letter and tucked it into her coat pocket, then returned to her work on the barn roof. but her hands moved more slowly now, and more than once she found herself glancing toward the western horizon where Samuel Reed was moving his cattle and wondering if he was, as his daughter suggested. Looking back, Margaret found herself reading Samuel Reed's letter 3 more times that evening, each reading revealing new layers of meaning she hadn't noticed before. The fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls as she sat in Thomas's old chair. The papers smoothed between her fingers from repeated handling. The words were simple enough, but something in their careful construction suggested a man who didn't write letters often, who had perhaps labored over each phrase. There were small ink blots where he'd paused, thinking, and the papers showed faint impressions where he'd pressed too hard with the pen. These imperfections somehow made the message more genuine than any flowery declaration might have been. "I've seen you working your land these past months." The phrase unsettled her more than she cared to admit. How long had he been watching? And from where? Her property sat in a shallow valley with good sight lines in all directions, a necessity for spotting trouble before it arrived. But she'd never noticed anyone observing her daily routines. The thought that she'd been going about her business under someone's gaze, however well-intentioned, made her feel exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the autumn wind. She tried to recall every encounter she might have had with Samuel Reed. The memory of the man at the market was clearer now, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair showing gray at the temples and hands that spoke of years working with rope and leather. He'd been leading a string of horses, fine animals with good conformation, and she remembered thinking he knew his business. When their eyes had met across the dusty street, his expression had been polite but reserved, the kind of acknowledgement one neighbor gives another without presuming familiarity. But there must have been other times, other moments when their paths had crossed without her full attention. Living alone, she'd trained herself to be aware of her surroundings, to notice strangers and potential threats. Yet somehow Samuel Reed had been watching her for months without registering as either. The realization brought a flush of something between embarrassment and indignation. Margaret prided herself on her self-sufficiency, on her ability to manage without depending on anyone else's notice or approval. The idea that a man had been observing her struggles and silently judging her competence, even if his judgment appeared favorable, challenged her carefully maintained sense of independence. "You do it with more grace than most men I know could manage." She read the line again, trying to decide if she felt complimented or patronized. Grace wasn't a word she'd have applied to her own efforts. When the fence posts needed setting, she set them. When the roof needed patching, she patched it. When the cattle needed moving, she moved them. There was nothing graceful about wrestling with a stubborn heifer or hauling water in the dead of winter. It was simply work that needed doing. Perhaps that was what he meant, though not grace in the sense of delicate femininity, but grace under pressure. The kind of steadiness that kept a person moving forward when everything seemed determined to push them back. The next morning brought a crisp clarity that made distant objects stand out sharp against the pale sky. Margaret fed her horses and chickens, milked her cow, and checked the fence line along the eastern pasture where coyotes had been testing the barriers. As she worked, she found herself glancing more often toward the western hills where Samuel Reed's ranch supposedly lay. She knew the creek he'd mentioned. Willow Creek ran through a narrow draw about 2 miles west of her property. Good water year-round and enough timber along its banks to provide shelter and building materials. It was prime ranching country, the kind of land that would support a decent-sized operation if a man had the resources and determination to work it properly. The fact that he was raising cattle there, apparently successfully enough to afford good horses, suggested Samuel Reed was neither a drifter nor a dreamer in this territory. Lasting more than one harsh winter required both skill and stubborn persistence. Lasting long enough to raise a daughter like Annie, polite, well-fed, and clearly loved, required considerably more than that. Margaret found herself wondering about Annie's mother. Though the letter had mentioned only the child, death was common enough on the frontier, claiming women in childbirth, men in accidents, and children from diseases that would be treatable back east. The fact that Samuel was raising his daughter alone suggested either tragedy or abandonment, and Annie's obvious devotion to her father argued strongly for the former. By afternoon, Margaret had convinced herself that dwelling on Samuel Reed's letter was both pointless and inappropriate. She had work to do, winter preparations that couldn't wait for her distraction to pass. She climbed back onto the barn roof, determined to finish the repairs before another storm system moved through. But concentration proved elusive. Every distant sound, wind through the grass, a hawk's cry, the lowing of her cattle, made her look up, scanning the horizon with new awareness. Had she been this oblivious to her surroundings before? Or was Samuel Reed's admission that he'd been watching simply making her more conscious of being watched? She was hammering down a particularly stubborn shingle when movement caught her eye near the gate. For a moment, her heart jumped with the irrational thought that Samuel himself had come calling. Instead, she saw Annie Reed again, this time accompanied by a shaggy brown dog that trotted beside her with the easy confidence of a longtime companion. Margaret climbed down from the roof and walked to meet them, noting that Annie looked less wind-blown today and carried a small basket covered with a checkered cloth. "Good afternoon. Annie, that's a fine-looking dog you have there." "This is Rusty," Annie said, scratching behind the dog's ears. "Papa said I could bring him today if I promised to keep him from chasing your chickens." "And what brings you back so soon? Your papa know you're here this time?" Annie's cheeks pinked slightly. "Yes'm, he knows. He said—" She paused, seeming to search for the right words. "He said if I was going to keep visiting, I ought to bring something to pay for my welcome." She lifted the basket, pulling back the cloth to reveal a small jar of honey, a paper packet that smelled of cinnamon, and what appeared to be fresh eggs nested in clean straw. "Papa keeps bees," Annie explained, "and these eggs are from our best layers. The packet's got cinnamon bark Papa traded for at the store. He thought you might like it for baking." Margaret accepted the basket, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. These were valuable commodities, especially with winter approaching. Honey would keep indefinitely and provide sweetness when other treats were scarce. Fresh eggs were precious enough that most people ate them sparingly, saving the majority for trade. Cinnamon was a luxury that cost real money at Henderson's general store. "This is very generous," she said. "Please tell your father I'm grateful." "You could tell him yourself," Annie said with the straightforward logic of childhood. "He's waiting by the creek. Said he didn't want to presume to approach your house without invitation, but he'd be happy to speak with you if you were of a mind to walk that way." Margaret felt her pulse quicken. So Samuel Reed was nearby, close enough to have sent his daughter ahead as an advance scout. The courtesy of not approaching uninvited showed respect for her privacy, but the proximity suggested he was genuinely interested in making her acquaintance. "Is he now?" she said, trying to keep her voice level. "And what if I'm not of a mind to walk that way?" Annie considered this seriously. "Then I reckon he'll wait a bit longer and then head home. Papa's patient when he needs to be." The child's matter-of-fact tone suggested this was exactly what Samuel had told her to say. No pressure, no demands. Just an opportunity offered and easily declined if unwanted. The approach was so different from what Margaret had experienced with other men in the territory. Men who saw her widowhood as either weakness to exploit or prize to claim, that it caught her off guard. "Well," she said finally, "I suppose a walk wouldn't hurt, but first, let's get these things put away properly, and you can tell me more about this patient papa of yours." They went into the cabin, where Margaret stored the honey and cinnamon in her small pantry and cracked one of the eggs into her flour tin to check its freshness. The yolk stood up bright and firm, confirming that Annie's family kept their chickens well. "Your father raises good stock," Margaret observed, wiping her hands on her apron. "Papa says animals know when you respect them," Annie replied, settling into the chair she'd occupied the day before. "He talks to them like they understand, and mostly they do what he asks without much fuss." It was an interesting philosophy, and one that spoke well of Samuel Reed's character. Men who were gentle with animals tended to be gentle with people, though Margaret knew there were exceptions to every rule. And what about you, Annie? Do you help with the animals? Yes'm. I feed the chickens and gather eggs, and Papa's teaching me to milk our cow. I can ride pretty well, too, though Papa makes me use the saddle instead of riding bareback like the boys in town. The mention of other children reminded Margaret of something she'd been wondering about. Do you go to school, dear? Annie's expression grew slightly wistful. There's no school close enough for daily attending. Papa teaches me reading and writing at home, and Mrs. Patterson in town gives lessons to some of the children when their folks can spare them. I go when Papa has business in town, which is maybe once a month. It was a common situation in the territory, where settlements were scattered and formal education was a luxury many families couldn't afford. The fact that Samuel was teaching his daughter himself suggested both education and patience. Not all parents possessed either the knowledge or temperament for such work. Your Papa sounds like a capable man, Margaret said carefully. He is. Annie agreed with obvious pride. He can fix most anything that breaks, and he knows about weather and water and which plants the cattle shouldn't eat. He taught me to recognize the signs that mean a storm's coming, and how to read the wind to know which way it'll blow. These were valuable skills, the kind of knowledge that could mean the difference between prosperity and disaster on the frontier. A man who possessed such wisdom and took the time to pass it on to his daughter was someone worth knowing, regardless of any romantic considerations. Margaret made her decision with the same practical deliberation she applied to all important choices. Samuel Reed had shown respect for her privacy, generosity with his resources, and patience in his approach. His daughter was polite, well cared for, and clearly devoted to him. If he wanted to make her acquaintance properly, she could at least give him the opportunity to do so. Well then, Annie, she said, untying her apron and reaching for her shawl. Why don't you lead the way to this patient Papa of yours, but mind you keep Rusty away from my chickens on the way out. Annie's face lit up with genuine delight, and she bounded toward the door with the irrepressible energy of childhood. Margaret followed more slowly, her mind already racing ahead to what she might say to Samuel Reed when they finally met face to face. The walk to Willow Creek took them across a stretch of rolling prairie that Margaret rarely traversed, though it lay less than half a mile from her property line. Annie led the way with the confidence of someone who had made this journey many times, Rusty ranging ahead to investigate interesting scents before circling back to check on his charges. The afternoon sun slanted low across the grassland, turning the dried stems to burnished gold and casting long shadows from the scattered stands of cottonwood that marked the creek's meandering path. As they crested a low rise, Margaret caught her first glimpse of Samuel Reed's operation. The ranch buildings nestled in a natural depression where the creek curved through a grove of willows, their yellowing leaves creating a windbreak against the constant prairie breeze. The main house was larger than her own cabin, built of logs chinked with mud and stone, with a proper stone chimney that spoke of permanence and planning. A substantial barn stood nearby, its doors open to reveal neat rows of stalls and the glint of well-maintained harness hanging from pegs along the walls. But it was the corrals that truly impressed her. 3 separate enclosures, each serving a different purpose, contained horses that, even at this distance, showed the quality breeding Samuel had demonstrated at the market. The animals moved with the easy grace of creatures well fed and properly cared for, their coats glossy in the autumn light. Papa's good with horses, Annie said, noticing Margaret's attention. Folks come from as far as Helena to trade with him. He says horses are honest. They tell you straight away if you're doing right by them or not. Margaret could see the truth of that philosophy in the contentment of the animals before them. These weren't the half-wild mustangs that many ranchers made do with, but carefully selected stock that represented both significant investment and considerable skill in their management. There's Papa, Annie announced, pointing toward the creek where a tall figure stood beside a bay gelding, apparently checking the animal's hooves. Even at this distance, Margaret recognized the man from the market, the same broad shoulders and confident posture, though today he wore work clothes rather than the cleaner shirt and vest he'd sported in town. As if sensing their approach, Samuel Reed straightened and turned in their direction. He said something to the horse, patted its neck, and began walking toward them with measured steps that suggested both courtesy and caution. He understood. Margaret realized that this meeting would set the tone for whatever relationship might develop between them, and he was determined not to begin it with any appearance of presumption. When they were close enough for comfortable conversation, Samuel removed his hat, revealing dark hair that was indeed graying at the temples and eyes the color of weathered denim. His face showed the lines that came from years of squinting into sun and wind, but his expression was open and patient, without the hard wariness that marked so many frontier men. "Miss Hale," he said, his voice carrying the slight roughness of someone more accustomed to talking to horses than making social conversation. "I'm pleased you decided to walk this way. I hope Annie hasn't been a bother to you." "Not at all," Margaret replied, studying his face for signs of the calculating interest she'd learned to recognize and avoid. Instead, she found something that looked remarkably like genuine nervousness. "She's been quite helpful, actually, and very polite." Samuel's expression relaxed slightly, and he glanced down at his daughter with obvious pride. "Annie knows her manners. Her mother saw to that before." He paused, and Margaret saw a flicker of old pain cross his features. Before she passed, Annie was only 4, but she remembers enough. The simple acknowledgement of his loss, offered without drama or request for sympathy, told Margaret more about Samuel Reed's character than a dozen flowery letters might have. He was a man who had faced tragedy and continued functioning, who had raised his daughter alone without losing sight of the values her mother had tried to instill. "I'm sorry for your loss," Margaret said quietly. "It couldn't have been easy, managing everything alone." "No easier than what you've been doing, I'd wager," Samuel replied, his eyes meeting hers with steady directness. "Takes considerable strength to keep a ranch running single-handed, especially with some of the challenges you've been facing." Margaret felt a slight chill that had nothing to do with the afternoon breeze. "What challenges would those be?" Samuel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Broken fence rails that weren't broken by weather, feed troughs overturned for no good reason. Small things, but the kind of small things that add up to bigger problems if left unchecked. The revelation that he'd been aware of the petty vandalism that had plagued her property over the past month struck Margaret like a physical blow. She'd told herself the incidents were random mischief, the work of restless young men with too much time and too little supervision. The thought that Samuel had been observing these problems without offering assistance initially sparked indignation. "And you've been watching this happen without saying anything?" she asked, her voice cooler than she'd intended. "I've been debating whether it was my place to interfere," Samuel admitted, his honesty disarming her anger before it could fully form. A woman values her independence, especially one who's proven she can manage on her own. "I didn't want to presume you needed help you hadn't asked for." The explanation was so reasonable, and delivered with such obvious respect for her autonomy, that Margaret found her irritation dissolving into something closer to gratitude. How many men would have shown such restraint? Most would have either ignored the situation entirely or charged in with unwanted assistance, assuming a woman couldn't handle her own problems. "But you've been concerned about it," she said, making it a statement rather than a question. "Concerned enough to lose sleep," Samuel confirmed, "especially after I started recognizing the pattern. What's been happening to your property isn't random mischief. Miss Hale, someone's been testing you, seeing how much trouble they can cause before you ask for help or give up entirely." The assessment sent an uncomfortable shiver down Margaret's spine. She'd suspected the same thing but had hoped she was being overly cautious. Hearing her fears confirmed by someone else made them suddenly, frighteningly real. "Do you have any idea who might be responsible?" she asked. Samuel was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting toward the western horizon before returning to her face. "I have suspicions, but suspicions aren't proof. What I can tell you is that it's likely to get worse before it gets better. Men who start with small harassment usually work their way up to bigger problems." Annie, who had been listening to this exchange with the serious attention children gave to adult conversations they sensed were important, stepped closer to her father. "Papa, you said we could help if Miss Margaret wanted us to." Samuel's expression softened as he looked down at his daughter, then back to Margaret. "What I said was that we'd be honored to help if Miss Hale thought it appropriate. The decision has to be hers." The offer was made with such careful respect for her independence that Margaret found herself considering it seriously rather than rejecting it outright. Samuel Reed wasn't trying to rescue her or take over her problems. He was simply offering assistance from one neighbor to another, the kind of mutual support that made survival possible in harsh country. "What kind of help did you have in mind?" she asked. "Nothing dramatic," Samuel said. "But I ride my property lines regularly, and it wouldn't be much trouble to extend that patrol to include your boundaries. Sometimes just knowing someone's keeping watch is enough to discourage troublemakers." It was a practical solution, one that would provide security without compromising her independence. Margaret found herself nodding before she'd fully made the decision. "That seems reasonable," she said. "Though I insist on reciprocating somehow, I don't accept charity." Samuel's mouth quirked in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "Wouldn't expect you to. Annie's been after me to invite you for Sunday dinner this week. If you're willing to share a meal and some conversation, we'll call it even." The invitation was casual enough to accept without feeling obligated, yet formal enough to show respect for proper courtship protocols. Margaret realized that Samuel Reed was navigating the complex social requirements of frontier romance with the same patient skill he apparently applied to training horses. "I'd be pleased to join you for dinner," she said, surprised by how much she meant it. "Sunday it is, then," Samuel said, settling his hat back on his head. "Around noon, if that suits you." As they spoke, Margaret became aware that the sun was sinking lower toward the western hills, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. The practical part of her mind noted that she needed to return home soon to tend her animals, but she found herself reluctant to end this first real conversation with Samuel Reed. "Papa," Annie said, tugging on her father's sleeve, "show Miss Margaret the new foal, the one that was born last week." Samuel glanced at Margaret questioningly. "If you have time, she's a beauty, and Annie's right proud of her." They walked toward the corrals, where a mare stood with a leggy foal that couldn't have been more than days old. The baby was a rich chestnut color with white markings on her face and legs, all awkward grace and curious intelligence as she investigated these new visitors. "She's lovely," Margaret said, and meant it. The foal showed the same quality breeding evident in the other horses, with good conformation and the alert expression that suggested intelligence. "Annie named her Star," Samuel said, watching his daughter coax the foal closer to the fence. "On account of that marking on her forehead." Margaret could see the white blaze that had inspired the name, a perfect diamond shape that caught the last rays of sunlight. "It suits her." They stood in comfortable silence, watching Annie interact with the young horse with the easy confidence of someone raised around animals. The scene was peaceful in a way that Margaret hadn't experienced in years, not just the absence of conflict, but the presence of genuine contentment. "I should be getting back," she said finally, though the words came reluctantly. "My animals will be expecting their evening feed." "Of course," Samuel said, but he made no move to hurry her departure. "Annie can walk you back if you'd like the company." "I'd appreciate that." Margaret admitted the prairie could be unpredictable after dark, and having a guide who knew the terrain would make the return journey safer. As they prepared to leave, Samuel stepped closer, close enough that Margaret caught the scent of leather and honest work that seemed to surround him. "Miss Hale," he said quietly, "I want you to know that I meant what I wrote in that letter, about respecting your strength. Not many people could have done what you've accomplished these past 3 years." The compliment, delivered with such obvious sincerity, warmed Margaret more than she'd expected. "Thank you," she said simply. "That means more than you might realize." Samuel nodded, stepped back, and touched the brim of his hat in farewell. Until Sunday, then. As Margaret and Annie walked back across the darkening prairie, the little girl chattered about the foal, the upcoming dinner, and her hopes that Margaret might teach her to bake proper bread. But Margaret found her attention drifting back to the man they'd left standing by his corrals, already planning the conversation she might have with him come Sunday, and wondering when she'd started looking forward to something other than mere survival. The changes began so subtly that Margaret almost convinced herself she was imagining them. On Thursday morning, she discovered that the loose gate latch on her chicken coop had been repaired with a new piece of hardware, not the rough field expedient she might have managed herself, but a proper metal clasp that would withstand both weather and the determined efforts of foxes. The work was neat, professional, and had clearly been done during the night when she wouldn't have noticed the intruder. For it was an intrusion, she told herself firmly, even if it was a benevolent one. Samuel Reed had no right to make repairs on her property without permission, regardless of how helpful those repairs might be. She spent the better part of the morning composing a stern speech about boundaries and independence, planning to deliver it when she saw him on Sunday. By Friday, however, her indignation had cooled into something closer to puzzled gratitude. Someone had reinforced the sagging corner of her hay shed with new support posts, and the work was so skillfully done that the repair blended seamlessly with the original construction. More mysteriously, her water trough had been cleaned and refilled, though she distinctly remembered it being nearly empty and filmed with algae the evening before. Saturday brought the most unsettling discovery yet. Margaret stepped outside to begin her morning chores, and found that someone had split and stacked nearly a full cord of firewood beside her cabin, the logs arranged with military precision and covered with a tarpaulin she didn't recognize. The wood was seasoned oak and pine, valuable enough that its theft would be noticed. Yet here it sat, as if it had materialized from thin air. She walked slowly around the pile, noting the clean, expert cuts and the careful attention to sizing each piece appropriately for her small fireplace. This represented hours of hard work, the kind of labor that left a man's back aching and his hands raw despite the protection of gloves. Someone had invested significant time and effort in ensuring she would stay warm through the coming winter. The realization that she was being cared for in such a methodical, invisible way stirred emotions Margaret wasn't prepared to examine. Since Thomas's death, she had grown accustomed to solving every problem herself, to viewing each challenge as a test of her competence and determination. The idea that someone might want to ease those burdens without recognition or reward was so foreign to her experience that she hardly knew how to respond. It was while she stood contemplating the mysterious firewood that Annie Reed appeared at her gate, this time leading a gentle-looking mare with a side saddle that had seen better days but was obviously well-maintained. "Good morning, Miss Margaret," Annie called out cheerfully. "Papa said I could ride over if I was careful about the gopher holes near the creek." Margaret walked to meet her, noting that the child's riding habit, while clearly homemade, was cut in a style that showed both skill and attention to propriety. Someone, presumably Samuel, had taken care to ensure his daughter would be appropriately dressed for her social visits. "That's a fine horse," Margaret observed, admiring the mare's calm demeanor and good condition. "What's her name?" "This is Buttercup," Annie said, dismounting with practiced ease. "Papa says she's the steadiest horse we've got, which is why he lets me ride her alone. She won't spook at rabbits or sudden noises, and she knows her way home even in the dark." The choice of mount revealed another layer of Samuel's character, his concern for his daughter's safety balanced against his recognition of her growing independence. It was the kind of careful parenting that produced children like Annie, confident but not reckless, capable but still appropriately cautious. "I brought something for you," Annie continued, producing a cloth-wrapped bundle from her saddlebag. "Papa made extra biscuits this morning, and he thought you might enjoy them with your coffee." Margaret accepted the package, still warm from the oven, and caught the scent of herbs that suggested these weren't ordinary biscuits. When she unwrapped them, she found a half-dozen golden rounds studded with what appeared to be wild sage and rosemary. a luxury that spoke of both skill and access to good ingredients. "Your papa is quite the cook," she said, surprised by the sophistication of the offering. "He learned from Mama," Annie explained. "She used to say that good food was one of the ways people showed love, so Papa made sure he could keep making the things she used to make for us." The simple statement carried such weight of loss and determination that Margaret felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. The image of Samuel Reed carefully learning his wife's recipes, preserving them for his daughter's sake, was almost unbearably poignant. "Would you like to come in and share one with me?" Margaret asked. "I was just about to put coffee on." Annie's face brightened. "Yes, please. And maybe I could help you with your chickens again. Papa says it's important to stay busy when you're visiting, so you don't wear out your welcome." They settled into what was becoming a comfortable routine, Annie tending the chickens while Margaret prepared coffee and warmed the biscuits in her small oven. The child worked with quiet efficiency, clearly experienced in such tasks, and Margaret found herself appreciating the companionship more than she'd expected. "Annie," she said as they sat down to eat, "has your papa been riding near my property lately?" The child's expression grew carefully neutral, the look of someone who had been coached on how to answer such questions. "Papa rides all over, checking on things. He says it's important to know what's happening in the neighborhood." It wasn't quite an answer, but it wasn't an evasion either. Margaret tried a different approach. "Someone's been doing repairs around my place, fixing things that needed attention. Would you happen to know anything about that?" Annie studied her biscuit with intense concentration. "Papa says sometimes neighbors help each other without making a fuss about it. He says that's how folks get by out here." The careful diplomacy of the response told Margaret everything she needed to know. Samuel was indeed her mysterious benefactor, but he had instructed his daughter not to admit it directly. The subterfuge was both exasperating and endearing. Clearly he wanted to help but was determined not to put her in the awkward position of having to acknowledge or refuse his assistance. "Your papa is a thoughtful man," Margaret said finally. "Yes, ma'am." Annie agreed with obvious relief. "He thinks about things a lot before he does them. Sometimes I catch him staring at nothing, and I know he's working out some problem in his head." They finished their breakfast in companionable silence, after which Annie helped Margaret with her morning chores. The child proved surprisingly helpful, feeding the chickens with just the right amount of grain and collecting eggs with careful attention to the hens' temperaments. She even helped Margaret repair a section of fence where the wire had come loose, holding the posts steady while Margaret wielded the hammer. It was while they worked that Margaret noticed Annie glancing frequently toward the road that led to town, her expression showing a tension that hadn't been there earlier. "Is everything all right, dear?" Margaret asked, pausing in her hammering. "Papa said there might be folks coming through today," Annie said carefully. "Said I should keep my eyes open and not linger too long away from home." The warning sent a chill down Margaret's spine. If Samuel was concerned enough to caution his daughter about staying too long at neighboring properties, then whatever threat he'd alluded to during their first meeting was more serious than she'd realized. "What kind of folks?" she asked, trying to keep her voice level. Annie's expression grew troubled. "The kind that don't have proper business in these parts. Papa says some men think they can push around folks who live alone, especially women. He says they're usually wrong about that, but they sometimes cause trouble before they figure it out." The child's matter-of-fact delivery of such an ominous message spoke volumes about the realities of frontier life. Even children learn to recognize and prepare for dangers that would have been unthinkable in more settled areas. Margaret finished securing the fence wire and straightened, scanning the horizon with new awareness. The prairie that had seemed peaceful and welcoming just moments before now felt exposed and vulnerable. She found herself wishing Samuel was closer, though she wasn't ready to admit that wish even to herself. "Perhaps you should head home soon," she suggested to Annie. "I wouldn't want your papa to worry." "Yes, ma'am." Annie agreed, but she made no immediate move toward her horse. Instead, she seemed to be gathering courage for something. "Miss Margaret, if bad folks do come around, You could always come stay with us for a while. Papa wouldn't mind, and I'd like the company." The offer was made with such genuine warmth that Margaret felt her chest tighten with gratitude. This child, barely 7 years old, was already thinking about others' welfare and offering what comfort she could. Samuel Reed was clearly raising his daughter to be a woman of substance and compassion. "That's very kind of you, Annie," Margaret said. "I'll keep it in mind." They walked together toward Buttercup, who had been patiently grazing near the gate. As Annie prepared to mount, she turned back with one final comment. "Papa wanted me to tell you that if you see any strangers around your place, there's a way to signal for help. If you hang something white, a sheet or towel, from your fence post near the road, he'll see it when he makes his evening rounds and come running." The practical nature of the arrangement impressed Margaret even as it underscored the seriousness of the potential threat. Samuel had clearly thought through various scenarios and prepared contingencies without being dramatic or alarmist about it. "Tell your papa I appreciate his thoughtfulness," Margaret said. "And Annie, thank you for the biscuits. They were delicious." Annie beamed with pride. "I'll tell him you said so. He'll be pleased." Margaret watched the child ride away, noting how confidently she handled the mare and how straight she sat in the saddle. Samuel was raising a daughter who would be capable of handling whatever challenges the frontier threw at her, and that spoke well of his own character and priorities. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret found herself returning repeatedly to the white cloth signal Annie had described. The fact that Samuel had thought to establish such a system suggested he took the potential threat seriously, and his willingness to respond to such a signal spoke of both courage and genuine concern for her welfare. She tried to tell herself that his interest was purely neighborly, the kind of mutual assistance that made survival possible in isolated areas. But the care with which he'd arranged for her protection, the thoughtfulness of his anonymous repairs, and the obvious instruction he'd given Annie about maintaining discretion all pointed to something deeper than simple neighborly concern. By evening, Margaret had made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. Tomorrow's dinner with Samuel and Annie would be about more than polite social interaction. It would be an opportunity to establish the terms of whatever relationship was developing between them, to determine whether Samuel Reed was the kind of man who could respect her independence while still offering the kind of partnership that might make both their lives richer and safer. As she banked her fire for the night, using wood from the mysterious pile that had appeared outside her door, Margaret allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to have someone to share the burdens and pleasures of frontier life. The thought was both terrifying and oddly comforting, like the warmth from Samuel's carefully split firewood that would keep her safe through the long winter nights ahead. Sunday morning dawned clear and cold, with frost silvering the grass and a sharp wind that promised winter's early arrival. Margaret dressed carefully for dinner at the Reed Ranch, choosing her best wool dress, a deep blue that Thomas had always said brought out her eyes, and taking unusual care with her hair. She told herself the effort was simple courtesy, but the butterflies in her stomach suggested otherwise. She was adjusting her shawl when the sound of hoofbeats made her look toward the road. A rider was approaching at an easy pace, but something about his posture struck her as wrong. Where Samuel Reed sat his horse with natural grace, and Annie rode with careful attention to her mount's needs. This man seemed to dominate his animal through force rather than partnership. Margaret stepped onto her porch, shading her eyes against the morning sun. The rider was Calvin Dorsey, a man she knew by reputation if not by close acquaintance. He owned a small spread south of town and was known for his loud voice at the saloon and his persistent attention to any unattached woman within riding distance. She'd managed to avoid him during her infrequent trips to town, but apparently he'd decided to seek her out at home. "Morning, Mrs. Hale," Calvin called out as he approached, touching his hat brim in a gesture that managed to seem mocking rather than respectful. "Fine day for visiting, don't you think?" "Mr. Dorsey," Margaret replied coolly, remaining on her porch rather than walking out to meet him. "What brings you out this way?" Calvin dismounted without invitation and tied his horse to her fence post. movements that spoke of presumed welcome rather than requested permission. He was a stocky man in his 40s, with thinning hair and small eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw for potential advantage. "Heard you might be in need of some masculine assistance around here," he said, gesturing broadly at her property. "Place like this is too much for a woman to handle alone. Lucky for you. I'm between projects right now and could spare some time to help set things right." The casual assumption that her property needed setting right rankled, but Margaret kept her voice level. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Dorsey, but I'm managing quite well on my own." "Are you now?" Calvin's eyes swept over the fence line, the barn, and the corrals with obvious skepticism. "Seems to me there's plenty here that could use a man's attention, and it's not healthy for a woman to live so isolated, especially one as handsome as yourself." The compliment felt like an insult, delivered with the kind of oily confidence that suggested Calvin considered his interest a favor he was bestowing. Margaret felt her jaw tighten but maintained her composure. "As I said, I'm managing fine. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have an engagement this morning." "An engagement?" Calvin's expression shifted, showing the first hint of genuine interest he displayed. "With whom, if you don't mind my asking?" Margaret minded very much, but she also recognized the implicit threat in his tone. Men like Calvin Dorsey didn't accept rejection gracefully, and she sensed that admitting to plans with another man might provoke exactly the kind of confrontation she'd been hoping to avoid. "I'm having dinner with the Reed family," she said carefully, watching his reaction. Calvin's face darkened. "Samuel Reed, you mean? That horse trader with the kid?" "Mr. Reed is a respected member of this community," Margaret replied, her voice growing colder. "As is his daughter." "Reed's been filling your head with nonsense." "Has he?" Calvin stepped closer to the porch, his manner becoming more aggressive. "Man's got his own interests at heart, you can be sure of that. What you need is someone who understands what a woman like you really requires." The implicit threat in his words was unmistakable, and Margaret felt her hand move instinctively toward the rifle she kept just inside the door. Calvin noticed the gesture and his smile turned unpleasant. "Now, that's not very neighborly," he said. "I'm just trying to have a conversation here. No need for dramatics." "And I'm trying to end one," Margaret replied firmly. "I've asked you politely to leave. I won't ask again." Calvin's expression hardened, but before he could respond, the sound of approaching horses made them both turn toward the road. 3 riders were coming from the direction of town, moving at a pace that suggested urgency rather than casual travel. Margaret felt a moment of panic, wondering if Calvin had brought companions for whatever purpose had brought him to her ranch. But as the riders drew closer, she recognized Samuel Reed in the lead, with 2 other men she knew by sight, Tom Patterson, who ran cattle east of town, and Jake Morrison, whose spread bordered the territorial road. Samuel's face was grim as he reined in near the gate, his eyes moving quickly from Margaret to Calvin and back again. The other 2 men spread out slightly, a casual movement that nonetheless positioned them to block any potential escape routes. "Morning, Margaret," Samuel said, his voice carrying a careful neutrality that didn't extend to his eyes. "Calvin, didn't expect to find you here." "Free country. Reed," Calvin replied, his earlier confidence wavering slightly in the face of 3-to-1 odds. "Last I checked, a man could visit his neighbors without asking your permission." "Visiting's one thing," Tom Patterson said mildly. He was an older man with gray whiskers and the kind of quiet authority that came from years of handling difficult situations. "Bothering folks is another." "I'm not bothering anyone," Calvin protested, but his eyes were already calculating distances and escape routes. "Just having a friendly conversation with Mrs. Hale here." Samuel dismounted with deliberate slowness, his movements controlled but ready. "Conversation implies 2 willing participants. Calvin, doesn't look to me like Mrs. Hale is particularly interested in talking." Margaret found herself caught between gratitude for the intervention and irritation at being discussed as if she weren't present. "I'm perfectly capable of handling my own conversations. Thank you." Samuel's eyes met hers briefly, and she saw acknowledgement of her independence along with unmistakable concern. "Of course you are, but neighbors look out for each other around here, and Calvin's been making something of a nuisance of himself lately." "I haven't done anything wrong," Calvin said, but his bluster was fading. "Man's got a right to court a lady if he's so inclined. Courting requires the lady's consent," Jake Morrison observed. He was younger than the other two men, but carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd faced down his share of trouble. "From where I sit, doesn't look like you got that." Calvin's face flushed red, but he was clearly outnumbered and outgunned. After a moment's hesitation, he stalked toward his horse, pausing only to deliver a parting shot. "This isn't finished. Reed. Woman like that needs proper guidance, and she's going to get it whether you interfere or not." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, and Margaret saw Samuel's hand move closer to the gun at his hip. But Calvin was already mounting his horse, apparently having decided that discretion was the better part of valor. "I'd think carefully about making threats, Calvin," Samuel said quietly, "especially ones you're not prepared to back up." Calvin spurred his horse harder than necessary and rode off toward town, leaving a cloud of dust and unfinished menace in his wake. The three men watched him go, their relaxed postures not quite concealing their readiness for trouble. "You all right, Margaret?" Samuel asked, finally turning his full attention to her. "I'm fine," she replied, though she could hear the slight tremor in her own voice. "He didn't do anything except make himself unwelcome. This time," Tom Patterson said grimly. "But men like Calvin Dorsey don't give up easy. He'll be back, and probably with a different approach." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn wind. "What kind of different approach?" Samuel and Tom exchanged glances, and she saw confirmation of fears she'd been trying to ignore. "The kind that happens when nobody's watching," Jake Morrison said bluntly. "Calvin's got a reputation for not taking no for an answer, especially from women who don't have menfolk to back them up." The casual reference to her vulnerability stung, but Margaret recognized the truth in it. She'd been living on borrowed time, managing to avoid serious trouble through a combination of isolation and luck. Calvin's visit suggested that both were running out. "What do you suggest I do about it?" she asked, proud that her voice remained steady. "For starters, don't travel alone," Samuel said, "especially not to town, and keep that rifle of yours close at hand. We'll be keeping an eye on things too." Tom added, "Calvin knows better than to cause trouble with witnesses around." Margaret nodded, understanding the implied protection while also recognizing its limitations. These men had their own properties and families to worry about. They couldn't provide constant surveillance, and Calvin would surely recognize that fact. "There's something else," Samuel said, his voice carefully neutral. "If you're still planning to join us for dinner today, Annie's been looking forward to it all week. Might be better if you stayed the night as well, until we can figure out Calvin's intentions." The offer was made with such careful respect for her independence that Margaret found herself considering it seriously. A night away from her ranch might indeed be wise, and it would give her time to think through her options without worrying about unwelcome visitors. "I appreciate the invitation," she said finally. "Let me gather a few things." As she packed a small bag with overnight necessities, Margaret could hear the men talking quietly outside. Their voices carried undertones of anger and concern that suggested Calvin Dorsey's behavior had been escalating for some time. She wondered how many other women in the territory had faced similar harassment, and how many had been forced to compromise their independence to ensure their safety. When she emerged from the cabin, Samuel was waiting beside a saddled horse, not one of his usual mounts, but a gentle-looking mare with a side saddle that appeared to have been hastily but expertly adjusted. "Borrowed her from Tom," Samuel explained, reading her questioning look. "Figured you'd prefer to ride rather than walk, and she's steady enough for a lady's saddle." The thoughtfulness of the gesture, arranged in the space of a few minutes while she'd been packing, touched Margaret more than she'd expected. Samuel Reed seemed to anticipate needs before they were even expressed. providing solutions without making her feel helpless or dependent. "Thank you," she said, accepting his assistance in mounting. "For everything." Samuel's eyes met hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Calvin Dorsey's made a mistake if he thinks you're without protection. Margaret, he'll learn otherwise soon enough." As they rode toward the Reed Ranch, Margaret found herself thinking about the implications of what had just happened. Calvin's visit had changed something fundamental about her situation, forcing her to confront the reality that her independence might come at a price she wasn't prepared to pay. The question now was whether accepting help, and perhaps more than help, from Samuel Reed was a compromise or a choice that might lead to something better than mere survival. The week following Calvin Dorsey's unwelcome visit passed in deceptive calm. Samuel had insisted on escorting Margaret back to her ranch Monday morning, and she'd found evidence of his continued vigilance in small signs around her property, hoof prints near her fence line that appeared each evening, and the occasional glimpse of a rider on the distant hills during daylight hours. The knowledge that she was being watched over should have been comforting, but Margaret found herself growing increasingly tense as each quiet day passed. Calvin himself had made no further appearances, but his absence felt more ominous than reassuring. Tom Patterson had stopped by Wednesday with news that Calvin had been drinking heavily at the saloon and making increasingly bitter comments about uppity women who didn't know their place. The report had prompted Samuel to suggest again that Margaret consider staying at the Reed Ranch until the situation resolved itself, but she'd politely declined. Running away felt too much like surrender. It was Friday night when the trouble finally came. Margaret had banked her fire early and gone to bed with the rifle propped beside her nightstand, a precaution that had become routine over the past week. The November wind howled around the cabin with unusual ferocity, rattling the windows and sending tree branches scraping against the roof in a rhythm that masked other sounds. She'd been dozing fitfully when the smell reached her, the acrid scent of smoke that didn't belong to her carefully banked fireplace. She was out of bed and at the window in seconds, her heart hammering as she peered through the darkness. Orange light flickered against the barn wall, and she could see flames dancing along the base of her hay shed. The structure that held her winter feed for the cattle was burning, and the wind was driving the fire toward the main barn where her horses were stabled. Margaret grabbed her rifle and ran for the door, not bothering with shoes or a coat over her nightgown. The cold hit her like a physical blow, but she ignored it as she raced toward the burning building. The horses were already nervous, their whinnies carrying notes of panic as the smell of smoke reached them. She reached the barn first, throwing open the doors and leading her 2 horses to safety before turning her attention to the fire itself. The hay shed was beyond saving. The dry fodder had caught too quickly and burned too hot, but she might be able to prevent the flames from spreading if she acted fast enough. It was while she was hauling buckets of water from the well that she heard the second set of hoofbeats approaching through the darkness. For a terrifying moment, she thought Calvin had returned to finish what he'd started, but the rider who materialized out of the smoke and wind was Samuel Reed, mounted on his fastest horse and leading a string of other men behind him. "Margaret," he called out, dismounting before his horse had fully stopped. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," she gasped, lugging another bucket toward the flames. "But the hay—" "Forget the hay," Samuel said, taking the bucket from her hands and passing it to Tom Patterson, who had arrived with Jake Morrison and the 2 other men Margaret recognized from town. "Get back from the fire. We'll handle this." Under normal circumstances, Margaret might have objected to being pushed aside, but the relief of having help overwhelmed her pride. The men formed an efficient bucket brigade, drawing water from her well in the nearby creek, while Samuel coordinated their efforts with the calm competence of someone who'd fought fires before. It took nearly 2 hours to extinguish the last of the flames and ensure that no sparks remained to rekindle the blaze. When it was finally over, Margaret's hay shed was a smoldering ruin, but the barn and cabin had been saved. Her winter feed was gone, but her livestock were safe and her shelter intact. As the other men prepared to leave, Samuel walked the perimeter of the burned area with a lantern, examining the ground with the methodical attention of someone looking for specific evidence. Margaret followed him, noting how his expression grew grimmer with each discovery. "What is it?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew. Samuel crouched beside what remained of the shed's foundation, pointing to a patch of earth that reflected the lantern light with an oily sheen. "Kerosene," he said quietly, "poured along the base of the wall to help the fire catch." Margaret felt her stomach clench with a mixture of fear and rage. "So it was deliberate, without question." Samuel stood, brushing dirt from his hands. "And there's more. Boot prints in the mud near the creek, leading away toward the road. Someone waited until the wind was strongest before setting the fire, then rode off expecting it to spread to your other buildings." The calculated malice of the attack was almost worse than the destruction itself. Someone had deliberately tried to destroy her livelihood, possibly her life, and had done so with careful planning and forethought. "Calvin?" she asked, though the answer seemed obvious. "Most likely." Samuel's jaw was tight with controlled anger. "But proving it will take more than boot prints and kerosene residue." They walked back toward the cabin, where Margaret suddenly became aware that she was standing in her nightgown in front of a group of men, her feet bare and her hair loose around her shoulders. The impropriety of the situation struck her with delayed embarrassment, but Samuel seemed to read her thoughts. "Tom brought some clothes from his wife," he said, gesturing toward a bundle on her porch. "Ellen figured you might need them after fighting a fire. She sent some coffee and food, too." The thoughtfulness of neighbors she barely knew brought unexpected tears to Margaret's eyes. In the 3 years since Thomas's death, she'd grown accustomed to handling crises alone, to depending on no one but herself for solutions and comfort. Having people appear in her hour of need, bringing help without being asked, was overwhelming in the best possible way. "I'll change and put coffee on," she said. "It's the least I can do after you all came running to help." "You'll do no such thing," Samuel said firmly. "You're coming back to my place for what's left of the night. Annie's already got a bed made up for you, and you can decide what to do next after you've had some rest." Margaret started to object, but Samuel cut her off with a look that brooked no argument. "This isn't about independence anymore. Margaret, someone just tried to burn you out, possibly kill you. Until we know who and why, you're not staying here alone." The stark assessment of her situation silenced Margaret's protests. She changed quickly into Ellen Patterson's borrowed clothes, a simple dress that was only slightly too large, and gathered a few essential belongings while Samuel waited outside. When she emerged, she found him examining something he'd picked up near the remains of the hay shed. "What did you find?" she asked. Samuel held up a small metal object that caught the lantern light. "Button," he said grimly. "Fancy one, with initials carved into it, the kind a man might wear on his good vest." Margaret leaned closer to examine the button, noting the elaborate scrollwork around what appeared to be the letters C.D. carved into the silver surface. "Calvin Dorsey." She breathed. "Looks that way." Samuel pocketed the button with obvious satisfaction. Careless of him to leave evidence behind, but men like Calvin usually think they're too smart to get caught. As they rode through the darkness toward the Reed Ranch, Margaret found herself stealing glances at Samuel's profile in the moonlight. He'd responded to her crisis without hesitation, organizing help and arriving so quickly that he must have been watching for signs of trouble. The knowledge that he'd been keeping such careful guard over her safety was both humbling and profoundly moving. "How did you know?" she asked finally. "About the fire. I mean, you arrived almost as quickly as if you'd been expecting it." Samuel was quiet for a moment, his hands steady on the reins as they navigated a particularly rough section of trail. "I've been making rounds every few hours since Calvin's visit," he admitted. "Something about the way he looked when he left. I had a feeling he wasn't finished." "You've been losing sleep to watch over my property." "I've been losing sleep anyway, worrying about what he might try next. At least this way I could do something useful with the insomnia." The casual way he dismissed his own sacrifice made Margaret's chest tight with emotions she wasn't ready to name. Samuel Reed had been protecting her at considerable cost to himself, asking for nothing in return except the knowledge that she was safe. They reached the Reed Ranch as the first pale light of dawn began to outline the eastern hills. Annie met them at the door, her small face serious with concern as she helped Margaret inside and fussed over getting her settled with blankets and hot tea. The child's obvious worry and relief spoke of a household that had been as anxious about Margaret's welfare as Margaret herself had been. Papa was scared, Annie confided as she brought Margaret a plate of food she was too exhausted to eat. He kept looking out the window and checking his rifle. I knew something bad was going to happen. Samuel appeared in the doorway, his expression softening as he looked at his daughter. Annie, Miss Margaret needs rest. You can visit with her after she's had some sleep. Yes, Papa. Annie kissed Margaret's cheek with spontaneous affection. I'm glad you're safe. I was praying for you all night. After Annie had gone to her own bed, Samuel sat down across from Margaret with his own cup of coffee, his face showing the strain of the long night. What happens now? Margaret asked, too tired to maintain her usual careful independence. Now we take that button to Sheriff Morrison, Samuel said. Jake's his cousin, and he'll make sure the evidence gets proper attention. With any luck, we can get Calvin arrested before he tries anything else. And if we can't, Samuel's eyes met hers with steady determination. Then we'll deal with whatever comes next. Together, if you'll let us. The simple offer, made without conditions or expectations, broke down the last of Margaret's resistance to accepting help. She'd been carrying the burden of survival alone for 3 years, telling herself that independence required complete self-sufficiency. But watching Samuel risk his own safety to protect hers, seeing Annie's genuine worry and affection, feeling the support of neighbors who barely knew her name, it all pointed to a different definition of strength. I'd like that, she said quietly. The together part, I mean. Samuel's smile was small but genuine, transforming his weathered face with unexpected warmth. Good, he said simply, because Annie and I have gotten rather attached to having you around. As Margaret finally settled into the comfortable bed Annie had prepared, listening to the quiet sounds of the Reed household beginning their day, she found herself thinking about how much had changed in a single night. Calvin Dorsey's attack had destroyed her hay shed and threatened her livelihood, but it had also forced her to accept what she'd been reluctant to acknowledge, that some things were worth more than independence, and some people were worth trusting with both her safety and her heart. Sheriff Morrison examined the silver button with the methodical attention of a man who'd learned not to rush to judgment. His office, a cramped room behind the general store that served as both courthouse and jail, smelled of old coffee and the lingering tobacco smoke from countless town meetings. Margaret sat beside Samuel on the hard wooden bench, acutely aware that half the town seemed to be finding reasons to pass by the window and peer inside. Initials are clear enough, the sheriff said finally, setting the button on his desk where it caught the morning light. And Tom Patterson confirms the kerosene smell around the burned area. But Calvin's going to claim he lost this button days ago, maybe weeks. Could have fallen off anywhere. Samuel's jaw tightened. You're saying there's not enough evidence? I'm saying Calvin Dorsey's got family money and a lawyer who comes up from Helena when needed. If we're going to make charges stick, we need more than circumstantial evidence, no matter how convincing it looks to us. Margaret felt the familiar frustration of frontier justice, or the lack thereof. Men with resources could often escape consequences that would fall heavily on those without connections or coin. She'd seen it before, watching men evade responsibility for debts, broken contracts, and worse simply because they could afford better representation than their victims. What about the threats he made? She asked. Tom and Jake both heard him say this wasn't finished. Sheriff Morrison nodded gravely. That helps, but threatening words aren't the same as proof of action. What we need is either a witness who saw him set the fire, or some way to get him to admit to it himself. The discussion was interrupted by a commotion outside, raised voices and the sound of someone demanding to be heard. Through the window, Margaret could see Calvin Dorsey himself approaching the sheriff's office, flanked by 2 men she didn't recognize, but who carried themselves with the confidence of hired muscle. Speak of the devil, Sheriff Morrison muttered, rising from his chair as Calvin pushed through the door without bothering to knock. Sheriff, Calvin said, his voice carrying the bluster of someone trying to project confidence he didn't feel. I understand there have been some wild accusations made against me. Thought I'd better come set the record straight before rumors got out of hand. His eyes swept over Margaret and Samuel with obvious disdain, lingering on Margaret in a way that made her skin crawl. The two men with him remained near the door, their positioning clearly intended to intimidate rather than merely accompany. No accusations yet, Calvin, Sheriff Morrison said mildly. Just questions about where you were last night around midnight. Home, of course, where any decent man would be at that hour. Calvin's tone suggested that staying home was a virtue others in the room clearly lacked. My hired men can confirm it. Been there all evening, discussing winter preparations. One of the men by the door nodded when the sheriff looked his way, though his expression suggested he'd say whatever Calvin was paying him to say. Margaret recognized the type, drifters who worked for whoever offered the best wages and asked the fewest questions about the nature of the work. Sheriff Morrison picked up the button from his desk, holding it where Calvin could see it clearly. Recognize this? Calvin barely glanced at the evidence. Looks like a button. Could belong to anyone. Anyone with the initials CD carved into it, Samuel said quietly. Fancy work, too. The kind a man might have done special in Helena or Butte. For just a moment, Calvin's composure slipped, and Margaret saw recognition flash across his features before he could suppress it. He knew the button, knew exactly where it had come from and how it had ended up near her burned hay shed. Lots of men have those initials, Calvin said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Could stand for Charles Davis, or Cyrus Donnelly, or any number of folks. Could. Sheriff Morrison agreed, but it was found at the scene of a fire that destroyed Margaret Hale's winter feed. Same night you were heard in the saloon talking about teaching uppity women their proper place. Calvin's face flushed red. I never said any such thing. If someone claims I did, they're lying. That's a serious accusation. Calvin, came a new voice from the doorway. Tom Patterson entered, followed by Jake Morrison and 3 other men Margaret recognized as substantial landowners in the area. Their presence clearly surprised Calvin, who'd apparently expected to face down only the sheriff and his accusers. Seems like you're calling half the territory liars, Tom continued, because we all heard what you had to say about Mrs. Hale and women in general. Some pretty specific threats, as I recall. Calvin looked around the crowded office, his confidence evaporating as he realized how outnumbered he was. These weren't just random townspeople, but men whose word carried weight in the community, men whose testimony would be believed by any judge or jury. You're all ganging up on me, he protested, taking the word of some woman over a man who's been part of this community for years. You've been part of this community for years, Jake Morrison said grimly, but you've never been a respected part of it. Most folks have been hoping you'd move on before you caused real trouble. And now you have, Samuel added, his voice carrying a cold anger that made Calvin step back involuntarily. Margaret could have died in that fire. Her horses, her cattle, everything she's worked for could have been destroyed, all because you can't accept that a woman has the right to refuse your advances. The blunt accusation hung in the air like gun smoke, and Margaret saw Calvin's face cycle through anger, fear, and desperation as he realized his position was becoming untenable. You can't prove anything, he said finally, but the words sounded hollow even to him. Sheriff Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying Calvin with the patient attention of a man who'd seen plenty of guilty men try to bluster their way out of consequences. Maybe not yet, he said mildly, but I'm thinking we should search your property, see if we can find a vest missing this particular button. And I'd like to have a word with your hired men here, separately, about exactly what time you all got home last night. Calvin's companions exchanged glances, and Margaret could see doubt creeping into their expressions. Whatever loyalty their wages had bought, it apparently didn't extend to risking perjury charges in front of witnesses. Now hold on, Calvin said quickly. No need for all that. Maybe I did lose that button somewhere around Mrs. Hale's place, but that doesn't mean I set any fire. Could have fallen off when I was visiting earlier this week. When you were visiting uninvited, Samuel corrected. When you were told to leave and threatened to come back. Calvin's face was pale now, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Margaret could see him calculating odds and realizing that his position was hopeless. Too many witnesses, too much evidence. Too many people who'd be happy to see him face consequences for his behavior. Look, he said finally, his voice cracking slightly. Maybe things got out of hand last night. Maybe I had too much to drink and made some poor decisions. But nobody got hurt, and most of the damage can be repaired. The admission sent a ripple of satisfaction through the crowded office. But Sheriff Morrison's expression remained stern. Are you confessing to arson, Calvin? Calvin looked around the room one more time, seeing nothing but hard faces and unsympathetic eyes. His hired men had edged closer to the door, clearly preparing to distance themselves from whatever confession might be coming. I'm saying, maybe I was angry about being rejected when I was just trying to be neighborly, he said finally. And maybe that anger led to some actions I regret this morning. It wasn't a full confession, but it was enough. Sheriff Morrison stood up, reaching for the handcuffs that hung from a peg on the wall. Calvin Dorsey, you're under arrest for arson and destruction of property. And given the threats you made, I'm inclined to add attempted intimidation of a witness. The next hour passed in a blur of legal procedures and paperwork. Calvin's hired men, faced with a choice between loyalty and self-preservation, quickly provided statements confirming that their employer had left the ranch around 11 o'clock the previous night and returned near dawn smelling of smoke and kerosene. Their testimony, combined with the physical evidence and Calvin's own partial admission, would be more than enough to secure a conviction. As word of the arrest spread through town, Margaret found herself the recipient of sympathy and support from neighbors she'd barely spoken to in 3 years of living in the territory. Women brought food and offers of help with winter preparations. Men discussed forming a cooperative to replace her lost hay and assist with other repairs. The community that had seemed distant and indifferent suddenly revealed itself as caring and protective. The trial, held the following week in the same cramped office that had served as an interrogation room, was swift and decisive. Calvin's lawyer, summoned from Helena at considerable expense, could do little in the face of overwhelming evidence and multiple witnesses. Calvin was sentenced to 6 months in the territorial prison and ordered to pay full restitution for Margaret's losses, including the cost of replacing her winter feed. More importantly, his public disgrace served as a warning to other men who might have been inclined to harass women living alone. The message was clear. The community would protect its own, and unwelcome advances would face serious consequences. As Margaret walked out of the makeshift courthouse with Samuel and Annie beside her, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt truly safe, not just because the immediate threat had been removed, but because she'd learned she wasn't as alone as she'd believed. Justice served, Samuel said quietly as they paused on the wooden sidewalk outside the general store. Justice and more, Margaret replied, looking around at the faces of people who had stood up for her, defended her, and welcomed her into their community. I don't think I understood before how much I'd been missing by trying to handle everything alone. Samuel's smile was warm and genuine. You were never as alone as you thought. You just needed to be willing to let people help. As they walked toward their horses, Margaret caught sight of Calvin being escorted to the wagon that would take him to prison. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the consequences of his actions and the public nature of his disgrace. She felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only relief that his capacity to harm others had been curtailed. What now? She asked Samuel as they prepared to ride back to their respective ranches. Now we get on with the business of living, he replied. And if you're willing, we do it together. The simple offer, made without fanfare or romantic dramatics, felt like the most natural thing in the world. Margaret looked at Samuel Reed, the man who had protected her, respected her independence, and helped her find her place in a community she'd thought had no room for her, and felt her heart settle into a rhythm of contentment she'd thought lost forever. "I'm willing," she said quietly. More than willing. The winter that followed Calvin Dorsey's conviction proved to be one of the mildest in recent memory, as if the territory itself had decided to offer Margaret a season of peace after the trials she'd endured. Snow fell in gentle dustings rather than the fierce blizzards that usually swept across the Montana plains. And the temperatures, while cold, never reached the bone-numbing extremes that could kill livestock and trap families in their cabins for weeks at a time. Margaret's new hayshed, built with lumber purchased using Calvin's restitution money and labor donated by neighbors, stood solid and well-stocked through the quiet months. Samuel had overseen the construction with his characteristic attention to detail, ensuring that the building was not only functional but designed to resist both weather and potential future mischief. The community effort that had gone into its construction seemed to symbolize Margaret's new position in the territory, no longer an outsider struggling alone, but a valued member of a network of mutual support. The relationship between Margaret and Samuel developed with the same careful deliberation that marked all their interactions. He visited her ranch regularly, sometimes accompanied by Annie, sometimes alone, always with a practical purpose that provided comfortable cover for their growing intimacy. There were fences to mend, livestock to move, and endless small repairs that seemed to require two sets of hands. Margaret found herself looking forward to these working partnerships, appreciating not only Samuel's competence but his quiet respect for her knowledge and capabilities. Annie had become a regular fixture at Margaret's cabin, spending afternoons learning to bake bread and helping with the household tasks that were easier accomplished with company. The child's presence brought a warmth to the small space that Margaret hadn't realized she'd been missing. And watching Samuel interact with his daughter revealed depths of patience and gentleness that made Margaret's heart ache with longing for the family life she'd thought lost forever. It was in early March, when the first green shoots began pushing through the remaining patches of snow, that Samuel arrived at Margaret's ranch carrying something wrapped in oiled cloth. Annie rode beside him, practically bouncing in her saddle with poorly concealed excitement, and both father and daughter wore expressions of nervous anticipation that immediately caught Margaret's attention. "You two look like you're planning mischief," Margaret observed as they dismounted near her cabin. "Should I be worried?" "Not worried," Samuel said, his usual composure showing cracks of uncertainty. "But maybe hopeful." Annie could contain herself no longer. "Papa's got something important to ask you, Miss Margaret, something he's been thinking about all winter." Samuel shot his daughter a look that was half exasperation and half affection. "Annie, we talked about letting me handle this my own way." "You've been practicing what to say for weeks," Annie replied with the devastating honesty of childhood. "And you still look like you're going to forget half of it." Margaret felt her pulse quicken as she began to understand what might be happening. The careful courtship of the past months, the growing intimacy of their partnership, the way Samuel's eyes had begun to linger on her face when he thought she wasn't looking. It all pointed toward a moment she'd been both anticipating and dreading. "Why don't we go inside?" she suggested, noting the way Samuel's hands trembled slightly as he clutched the mysterious bundle. "I've got coffee on, and Annie can tell me about the new foal while you collect your thoughts." The domesticity of the suggestion seemed to calm Samuel's nerves, and they settled into the familiar rhythm of shared coffee and conversation. Annie chattered about Star's progress and the other happenings around the Reed Ranch, but Margaret could see that both father and daughter were waiting for something, building up to a moment that felt inevitable and terrifying in equal measure. Finally, as Annie's stream of conversation began to wind down, Samuel cleared his throat and set his coffee cup aside with deliberate precision. "Margaret," he began, his voice carrying the formal cadence of someone who had indeed practiced these words. "These past months have meant more to me than I know how to express properly. Having you in our lives, watching Annie grow fond of you, seeing how well we work together. It's made me realize how much I've been missing." Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs, but she remained silent, sensing that Samuel needed to say this in his own way and his own time. "I know you value your independence," he continued, his eyes meeting hers with steady sincerity. "And I want you to know that I'm not asking you to give that up. What I'm hoping for is a partnership, a true joining of our lives and our ranches, where we face whatever comes next together." He reached for the bundle he'd carried in, unwrapping it to reveal a small wooden box that showed the careful craftsmanship of someone who worked with his hands. Inside, nestled in a bed of soft cloth, lay a silver ring set with a modest but beautifully cut stone that caught the afternoon light streaming through the cabin window. "This was my mother's ring," Samuel said quietly. "She wore it for 40 years, through good times and hard ones. And she told me before she died that I should only give it to a woman who could match her strength and stubbornness." Annie giggled at this description, but Margaret found herself too moved to speak. The ring was beautiful in its simplicity, clearly well loved and cared for, representing not just Samuel's proposal but his family's acceptance of her. "I can't promise you an easy life," Samuel continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke from the heart rather than from rehearsed words. "The territory's still hard country, and there will always be challenges we can't predict, but I can promise that you'll never face those challenges alone again, and that Annie and I will do everything in our power to make you happy." Margaret looked from Samuel's earnest face to Annie's bright eyes, seeing in both expressions the same hope and vulnerability that she felt in her own heart. The decision that had seemed so monumental just moments before suddenly felt as natural as breathing. "Samuel Reed," she said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill over. "I would be honored to be your wife and Annie's stepmother." Annie's whoop of joy filled the small cabin as Samuel's face transformed with relief and happiness. He slipped the ring onto Margaret's finger with hands that shook only slightly, and she was surprised by how perfectly it fit, as if it had been waiting all these years for her to claim it. "When?" Annie demanded, bouncing in her chair with irrepressible excitement. "When will you get married? Can I help with the dress? Can we have a party?" Samuel laughed, the sound rich with contentment. "Soon," he promised, his eyes never leaving Margaret's face. "As soon as we can arrange for a proper ceremony." The next few weeks passed in a blur of preparations and planning. Word of the engagement spread quickly through the territory, bringing congratulations from neighbors and offers of assistance with everything from flowers for the ceremony to furniture for combining their two households. Margaret was touched by the genuine warmth of the community's response, though she insisted on keeping the celebration simple and practical. They decided to hold the ceremony at the Reed Ranch, which had more space for guests and better facilities for the meal that would follow. Annie threw herself into the preparations with the enthusiasm of someone who had been hoping for exactly this outcome, helping Margaret plan everything from the menu to the arrangement of wildflowers that would decorate the tables. The wedding took place on a warm Saturday in April, with the cottonwoods along Willow Creek just beginning to show their new green leaves. Margaret wore her best dress, the blue wool that Samuel had always admired, with a simple veil that had belonged to his first wife. The gesture of wearing Elizabeth's veil had been Samuel's suggestion, a way of honoring his daughter's mother while welcoming Margaret into their family circle. Sheriff Morrison, who had gained some experience with frontier ceremonies, performed the service in the meadow behind the Reed cabin, with Annie standing proudly beside them as both witness and flower girl. The assembled guests, ranchers and townspeople who had become genuine friends over the winter months, watched with obvious approval as Margaret and Samuel exchanged vows that emphasized partnership and mutual respect rather than traditional promises of obedience. When Samuel kissed his new wife, sealing their union before God and community, the cheer that went up from the assembled crowd could be heard clear across the valley. Tom Patterson produced a fiddle he'd kept hidden for the occasion, and the impromptu celebration that followed lasted well into the evening, with dancing and storytelling and enough food to feed twice the number of people present. As the sun set over the Montana Territory, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Margaret found herself standing beside her new husband, watching Annie chase fireflies in the meadow. The child's laughter carried on the warm evening air, mixing with the sound of fiddle music and the contented conversation of neighbors who had become family. "Any regrets?" Samuel asked quietly, his arm settling comfortably around Margaret's waist. Margaret leaned into his warmth, thinking of all the paths that had led her to this moment. The grief of losing Thomas, the struggle to survive alone, the terror of Calvin's harassment, and the gradual recognition that accepting help didn't mean surrendering strength. "Only one," she said, smiling as she watched Annie capture a particularly elusive firefly. "I wish I'd been brave enough to accept what you were offering sooner." Samuel's chuckle rumbled through his chest. "We had to take our time. Some things are worth waiting for." As the last guests prepared to leave and Annie finally consented to going to bed, Margaret walked hand in hand with her husband toward the cabin that was now truly their home. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and responsibilities, the endless work of building a life together in unforgiving country. But tonight, surrounded by the evidence of community support and blessed with the promise of partnership, Margaret Reed felt ready for whatever the future might hold. The little girl who had delivered a letter about a father who couldn't stop thinking had unknowingly delivered much more. The promise that love could grow quietly in the most unexpected places, that strength could be shared without being diminished, and that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was trust someone else with their carefully guarded heart.